Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Emily Green. I'm the Director of Member Engagement and Events with Save the Sound. And I'm very excited to welcome you today to our second webinar in the member exclusive series. So the first presentation, we explored how regenerative ocean farming is improving the Sound's health and fighting climate change, and you can find that recording in our digital archive page, and I'll share the link with that in the chat box after the introduction. Today we'll be heading for dry land and looking at regenerative agriculture and how this farming system is not only providing us with higher quality food, but also restoring our ecosystems, increasing biodiversity, and combating climate change. So before we jump in, some quick housekeeping that we are recording. So I'm going to ask everyone to please stay muted for the duration of the webinar. We're going to hear each presenter, then open it up for Q&A at the end. And as we go along, feel free to type any questions you have into the chat box, and we will address them at the end. Also, before we kick off, I want to thank the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Connecticut, also known as CT-NOFA. They are the sponsor of this webinar series. Their mission is to ensure the growth and viability of organic agriculture, organic food, and organic land in Connecticut. And all of our presenters today are members of Connecticut NOFA. So we've got a great panel for this topic, and I'm going to introduce everybody quickly now and then hand it off. For starters, we have Steve Munno, and he is the farm manager at Massaro Community Farm in Woodbridge, Connecticut. It's a nonprofit certified organic farm which operates a CSA, sells to local markets, offers on-farm educational programs and events, and donates at least 10% of its annual harvest to hunger relief organizations. Steve was a co-founding member of the New Connecticut Farmer Alliance and currently serves as board president of CSA. We also have from Caracas, Venezuela, Domingo Medina is an educator and a human geographer with an MSc and PhD in natural resource management and community development from Michigan State University. As a research associate for the Venezuelan Association for the Conservation of Natural Areas, Domingo worked for 12 years in rainforest environments on issues of resource conservation, land rights, land use change, and eco-health of indigenous peoples and peasant and protected areas. In New Haven, Domingo has been involved in farming since 2005, working in a CSA and a community garden, producing organic food and learning about the links between healthy soils and plants, nutritious food, and human health. He's been involved in many projects with the New Haven Bioregional Group that promotes a sense of place environmental awareness and community resilience. Domingo is a certified Yukon Master Composter and certified compost operation manager and a local entrepreneur, founder, and director of operations of Peels and Wheels Composting LLC, a neighborhood pedal-powered food scrap pickup and composting service that promotes community composting in New Haven to amend urban soils for growing food and mitigate environmental pollution from waste incineration while generating local green jobs. Our final panelist will be Zephyra Alexandra, the seed huntress. Zephyra is an endurance race ethnobotanist on a perennial botanical expedition to preserve the biodiversity of our wild and cultivated lands through seed conservation. Currently, she is leading CT-NOFA's Pollinator Health Initiative, the Ecotype Project, to amplify the amount of truly native, local native seed available for ecological restoration. Zephyra is of the Crop Trust, has worked with agrarian leaders on island nations after natural disasters to safeguard their community seed banks, and has been reviving the local allium heirloom, the Southport Globe onion, in her home state of Connecticut. Seed sovereignty is one of the great tools of regenerative resilience. Okay, so we're gonna kick it off with Steve, and I will let him take it away now after all of the long introduction. And just a reminder, stay muted while our presenters are speaking.
So I want to talk about the regenerative agriculture work we do here at Massaro Community Farm in Woodbridge, which is just outside of New Haven. And in getting ready for this, I just thought it would be helpful to lay out a few terms, which is sometimes get used interchangeably, but have their own meanings. So organic is USDA defined. There's a national organic program, and there's rules and regulations that are enforced by certifiers, and there are standards and requirements. There's lists of allowed products for use in production. And I'm sure, as you all know, there are farms that are certified for organic or not. And farms may be following organic practices without getting certified. Sustainable is, typically means meeting the needs of the present without compromising future generations and stewardship of our resources. There is a legal definition for it, but there's not a sort of similar parallel certification. Regenerative usually talks about just increasing biological activity and biodiversity, replenishing our resources, creating new growth and new opportunities. Another word you'll hear a lot is restorative, which often means like removing contamination or repairing a place or bringing something back into production or land or back into production that has been out of production. So, in some way, all of these things have happened at Massaro. We are certified organic, and we want to be sustainable, and we are trying to be regenerative, and in some cases we have actually restored to bring areas back into production. So in some ways these all work together, but it's helpful to understand the terms going forward here. So what's happening at Massaro Community Farm? Our mission is to keep farming, feed people, build community. This was a dairy farm. The Massaro family came here from Italy in 1916 and had over 100 acres of dairy. They lasted 2 generations doing that, and then sold off part of the land, and then 57 acres were put into a conservation easement with the town of Woodbridge. And it had been inactive for some time, and there were people in the community who wanted to see it become an active farm again, get it up and running, and grow organic produce for the greater New Haven and Naugatuck Valley communities. So they were able to create the nonprofit organization, Massaro Community Farm, and get a lease from the town. We had a 20-year lease on the property. And 2010 was the first year of growing. We grew on 4 acres of the land, had a Pioneer CSA subscription for 125 subscribers. And then by 2019, we were using 10 acres, have over 200 subscribers, and we're going to farmers markets and selling to New Haven area restaurants. Last year with COVID, we added even more CSA subscribers, created an online store, added products from partner farms, and stopped going to the markets and limited restaurant sales. We'll hope to bring those things back once we're out of the woods with COVID. We are certified 10% of our annual harvest to hunger relief organizations. And though we've adapted during COVID, we do offer on-farm educational programs and events throughout the year. Okay, so here's a look at our field. So what you see here is where we're growing. It's about 15 acres that you can see there. We've been growing on 10, and we're still working on another 4 to 5 to restore. Bigger view of the property, you can see the 57 acres, and I think you can follow my cursor. Maybe there's a little gas line that runs through. That's kind of the end of our property. So most of the property is woods and wetlands. We have a couple of streams that run through, that are flowing when it's after rains and during the wet season, and dry up during the summer. And then if you move out a little bit further, we're approximately 14 miles from the Long Island Sound. So there's us, and we go right out to the Sound. Incidentally, I grew up on the other side of the Sound on Long Island, right there by Queens. So, when you look at it this way, you can see the kind of impact we can have on the water, depending on what we're doing. And of course, one of the reasons why we're here talking about this is that farmers are stewards, and we play a key role in ecological and climate restoration. And I think that's why a lot of people wanted to see this farm get up and running, is not only to provide food, but to play a role in this ecological and climate restoration. So the stewardship practices that we're doing, some of you've probably heard of cover cropping, crop rotation, conservation tillage. We're talking about things that improve ecosystem biodiversity. We want to protect soil from erosion and build organic matter. We want to feed that soil biology. We want to attract beneficial insects, create habitat for native pollinators. We want to suppress weeds and invasive species, capture carbon, prevent nutrient leaching. This is the kind of work that farmers need to be doing, that we're doing here at Massaro. Increasing biodiversity has been a key one as well. When I arrived, in addition to getting, crops in the ground and food to people, I wanted to make sure that we were creating habitat. So that's going to make a healthy growing system by creating a healthy habitat and a healthy ecosystem, mimicking nature and mimicking natural systems. So one of the first things I did was plant strips of native trees and shrubs and create areas where there's lots of resources for pollinators and native wildlife. On the borders of our farms, in between our fields, trying to make food sources continually available for pollinators and native wildlife. We want to supply a diversity of food sources and try to have a mix of plant families and species, so that we've got multiple species flowering on the farm from as early in the season to as late in the season as possible. So, there's a mix of strategies we do even on our, in our production. So it's not just these borders. We'll interplant with our crops some things that will flower. We'll dedicate rows in our crop blocks so that there's flowering species throughout the year to feed them. Cover crops, if this is not a familiar term, cover crops are crops that we grow to enhance the soil and protect the soil, as opposed to a cash crop that will grow to harvest for market. What you see here is a field of peas, vetch, and oats. It's 3 species that we mix together. We'll plant either in the spring or the fall. It's a mix of species that I like because we get 2 legumes, which are going to fix nitrogen and help with our plant growth. They've also got differing root systems. So the peas and the vetch are those legumes that are going to fix nitrogen. But we've also got tap roots and fibrous roots underground. So there's a lot happening underground as well as above the ground. And then we've got oats that are growing thin and tall, peas that are broad and wide, and that vines from the vetch that kind of intersect between them. So it's really taking up this all the usable space here. So we're getting a lot of biomass. Here's a picture from our field, one of our field edges, clover and flower. We want to use as much space to grow food, but we really do need to have dedicated space for flowers on our fields. So we do season extension using our high tunnels. So those are unheated greenhouses, and right now they're full of kale, arugula, lettuce, carrots, radishes. But the space between those tunnels we want to grow as well. We want to use every square inch we can to be productive and be restorative and supply something for the ecosystem. So here you can see, this is from last spring, all the clover we had planted in the fall, grown up and flowered, and the purple in the foreground there is vetch, so that we had mixed in there. So, these are some of the earliest things we can get up and flowering in the spring. And the nice thing about that is we didn't have to take any action in the spring to do it. We took care of that in the fall. So by limiting disturbance, by getting the seeds down in the fall, we don't have to disturb the soil at all in the spring and still get a usable crop or a productive crop for the environment. Here's another look at that peas, vetch, and oats mix from a different angle. Flowering peas, nice and pink and red. Flowering vetch, nice and purple. And what we'll do with this, again, minimizing soil disturbance, we can just mow this. This is green manure. We don't have cows here on the farm anymore. The Massaro family had a dairy farm here, but this is now, a vegetable operation. So in order to replenish our soil, we use this green manure to feed the life in the soil and to feed the crops that'll grow after it. So we can mow it right in place, leave all that debris there, and let it incorporate into the soil, and that feeds all the fungal life, the bacterial life, and all the invertebrates in the soil that make our soil so lively and feed our crops. There's another field that in July. So we've got it all throughout the farm. Even paths that we drive on, this is a path where we typically drive our tractor and our trucks for harvest. We've got that, we try to limit our mowing so we can let all of that go to flower. Again, resources for our native bees and pollinators, as well as our honeybees. And really just, it's lovely to walk around the farm when you've got this happening, when you've got floral sources everywhere. It's quite enjoyable. Later in the season, and actually throughout the year, buckwheat is something I really like. Again, here's a little strip next to our tunnels, using all the available space we can to get something, create that biomass, create those floral sources. And right next to our crops as well. I talked earlier about suppressing weeds. We've got our crop here of summer squash, and right along the edge of the bed, we've got the buckwheat growing right next to it, flowering, helping attract bees to pollinate our squash crop, and also, get the kind of growth that we want in the path, as opposed to weeds or invasive species. And here we're growing potatoes. We've got them covered with a row cover to keep pests off, and we're using every bit of space we can. Again, filling that up with filling those path space with buckwheat, and we'll easily mow that down, with a push mower, and let that incorporate right back into the soil and feed that soil for us. Keep that organic matter growing. And then for crops that are in the ground, a long time, like eggplants, peppers, tomatoes, we'll sow oats and clover. Again, we don't want bare soil there. We want to improve our organic matter and reduce the possibilities of erosion. And we're going to be walking down these paths, every couple days from late July through the end of September into October. We want to protect it and have something useful growing there. So the oats and clover make a great growing path for us and walking path. And then, Connecticut is funny with the weather here. Some years we get a frost. We had a late September frost this last year, and sometimes we don't get a frost until November. So we're trying to grow our crops as late in the season as possible outside. And even though, we might want to harvest these brassicas like kale and cabbage as late as we can, you don't have to wait till you finish a crop to sow in a cover crop to protect the soil for the winter. So this is what our frost-killed buckwheat looks like. We sowed this buckwheat, over the plants in August. They didn't compete with our vegetables. They filled in the space between, and when the frost comes, our brassicas are nice and hardy. They survive that frost, but the buckwheat just starts to die off, and it'll sort of die in place and create a protective mulch for the soil for the winter. So we're still able to use the crop for the ground for the productive harvest, and also get that protective mulch and get that extra organic matter. I mentioned conservation tillage and reduced tillage earlier. We also, are practicing no-till here. So, that we do have tractors on our farm, and we are doing some tillage. We've always tried to reduce and limit our tillage, and we have a plot of about an acre where we're not doing any tillage at all. So this is a picture of some young vetch growing in April after having the peas, vetch, oats mix sown in the fall. The peas and the oats have died, but the vetch survives the winter and actually starts to grow and thrive in the spring. And you can see it gets real dense, a lot of organic matter, nitrogen fixing. And then what we've done there after that is we mow it down and we let the residue sit, and we put a black tarp over the ground, so we don't have to do any soil disturbance in order to prep for our crops. So this is what that looked like after mowing, and then 7 to 8 weeks of the tarp on top of it. We're ready to plant in there. And then a little bit later, here's a mix of our fall greens and roots: carrots, radishes, onions, which we'll harvest this spring, salad mix, beets, radishes, turnips. We had a really wonderful harvest here this fall. I also mentioned, attracting pollinators. We dedicated some space. We had a quarter-acre pollinator planting with over 50 species and 3,300 plugs. You can get a look at all the different kinds of flowers we're trying to have here. Again, as I mentioned, as early in the season to as late in the season as possible. And some things, we can use, in addition to supporting the pollinators, of course, we can make bouquets, we can do dried arrangements with these things. There's all sorts of ways to incorporate this into the business of the farm as well. But, mostly we're looking here at our ecological health and trying to create that habitat. As I mentioned, also, interplanting in our row crops as well. So our cabbage plantings, cabbage is going to be spaced a couple feet apart. We can stick some dill right between them, harvest that dill, and then let it go to flower. And that's going to create habitat for beneficial insects that'll keep pests off of our cabbage, and also make it quite pleasant for us going through there. Likewise, our cilantro is one of the things I really like to let flower. It's a crop we'll harvest until we can't anymore, and then we'll leave it in place so that it's providing that resource for the pollinators. Here's a close-up view of their bees out on our pollinators. So if you're not familiar with Tulsi or holy basil, we often find it used for tea. We've been growing this for 4 or 5 years now, and it just seems to be the epicenter for pollinators on the farm. Wherever we plant it, it's just a buzz. Thousands of bees, all sorts of different species, and you can hear it like an airport coming towards it. It's just the buzz is so loud, and it's a really wonderful crop. So if you're looking for something to grow at home, to attract bees, butterflies, this is one that's got the multi-use. It's very for your home use, for tea, but really the pollinators have loved it, and it's very easy to grow. Another thing that sort of farms and farmers can do is use partners and practices to reduce energy use and reduce that carbon footprint. So we've been lucky enough to partner with the town and with an organization to put solar panels on our barn and hopefully reduce our energy usage. I think the key thing here is that farmers can grow food and fiber and do the improving and restoration of our local, regional, and global ecosystems. I mean, this is what brought me to farming. I didn't grow up on a farm. I grew up in a suburb of Long Island. I didn't know any farmers or any gardeners really either. And I found myself doing education work in the wilderness, doing education work about environmental stewardship, and just helping out with a farmer and doing some gardening, and found myself eventually thinking that really farming was the best work I could do to be a steward of a local ecosystem, and in that way, help with the necessary work of global ecosystem restoration and climate change prevention. I don't know if I've gone over time here, but that's what I've got for now.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. I'm gonna pass the mic over to Domingo now.
Hey, can you hear me? Everything's okay?
Everything's great.
Good. So my presentation is a bit more conceptual in the sense that, I'm not going to be speaking what I do, but how I see the role of composting and its connection with regenerative farming and climate change. So I'm going to speak about this. I was reviewing the webpage of this soil subgroup linked to the Working and Natural Lands Working Group in agriculture, and it's recognized the power of soil to be a significant carbon sink, and anything we can do to not alter the soil and its capability of storing carbon, it's key. So the way we do agriculture, the way we treat our soils, the way we develop them, it's key in terms of their role to be able to balance the amount of carbon into the system. And so Steve already mentioned some of the practices, and certainly no-tilling or cover cropping, it's an important type of practice that reduce agriculture emissions. That is normally done through the exposure. If you know, if not taken care of, basically what you have is a lot of soil respiration through the microbial activity that releases a lot of CO2 into the air. So not disturbance is very important as a mechanism. And of course, within the agriculture, in the regenerative agriculture world, the importance of healthy soil is key, because if you have a healthy soil, you'll be able to have all these beneficial effects associated with mitigating runoff, you know, reducing irrigation needs, to be able to hold more nutrients, and so on. So the way how we understand mechanisms of sequestering and holding carbon is key in the understanding of the type of practice that we have to, you know, promote. In the case of compost, you know, decomposition of organic material is going to happen independently of us. You know, you can see this in the forest. You can see it even in farms where you have this debris of organic material left behind alone. Things will decompose. You'll have the natural process of decomposition through biological processes. When you talk about composting, is that we are creating the conditions for this to happen in a more rapid way. Okay, so compost is the biological decomposition of organic matter into a much more biological, stable, pathogen-free, humus-rich substance suitable for soils and growing plants. And we do it under very specific conditions of aeration, because that's the type of microbes that are doing this type of work, moisture conditions, and thermophilic temperature. So we, as composter, we create those conditions, optimal conditions for this to happen. And basically, these are the parameters that we manage. You know, we manage the moisture levels in our compost, we manage the aeration, the particle size, the bulk density, and we can, you know, we can have very nice compost in a matter of 30 days. So we can produce a lot of carbon in a matter much rapid than nature if we left them alone. Okay, and of course we go through a process that go through different active stages and curing stages, where different microorganisms plays a role in the breakdown of, you know, different type of compounds of proteins and carbons and hemicellulose and so on. And it's all about you know, creating conditions for the soil food way to act and break down this material in a way that it's humus-like and that can be used for growing plants and so on. So key in composting is, you know, why we do composting, and certainly the interest of this webinar is that, you know, is linked to climate change, and I'll explain that a bit later. But also it's understanding the carbon-oxygen cycle. You know, part of this is that, you know, there's a carbon-oxygen cycle that happens, and we have altered over time by exaggerating the amount of emissions. And the part of composting is how can we sequester and bring it down to the soil. And there are many methods, and I'm not going to get into it. And then certain quality aspects that not all composts are equal, but the compost quality is important for the type of use that we want to make. And of course, you know, we have compost used for making blends for application, for soil amendment, for soil erosion, but in this case, to sequester carbon for mitigated climate change. So, you know, when you asked me to talk about this, you know, my head exploded in the sense that there's so many ways of tackling this, but this is the best way I'm going to find out to explain it to you. Directly composting, you know that every time we throw away a bag of trash in our from our household, you know, it's estimated by between 35% and 40% of that is in the content of that trash is organic material that could be composted. And, you know, right now in Connecticut, we don't have landfills anymore. Now, the only thing we have left is municipal incineration. So we're burning all that organic matter. So before we had landfills, we were producing a lot of greenhouse gases, specifically methane, by putting into landfills. And now that we're burning everything, we are basically creating a lot of gases into the air. So in the terms of composting is that we can eliminate the possibility of landfilling and incinerating and trying to sequester that carbon through not only the breakdown, basically through the breakdown of that organic matter and store it in the bodies of microbes in the soil. Okay, so that's from the part of the individual point of view, from community gardens, for farms and so on. But the real treasure of composting is when we use it as another tool in regenerative farming, which is not mentioned, is very few people mentions this. We talk about cover crop, we talk about no-tilling or crop rotation, using multiple crops to increase biodiversity. But basically, regenerative farming is about soil health. Okay, the regenerative agriculture, what it does is utilizes photosynthesis and aerobic soil microbes to draw down greenhouse gases. That's the way I see it. That's how it's reduced. And basically, of course, as a farmer, you want to have plant health, you want productivity, and you want a nutrient-rich food. So whatever we do in terms of farming that contributes to that type of mechanisms to draw down that carbon, some of them call it carbon farming, we are making a major difference. Now, with composting, we're attacking a specific mechanism of how we go about building soil organic matter. We mentioned soil organic matter, but we don't define it and we don't explain it. But soil organic matter, basically, it conforms to 1 to 5% of what is soil. And organic matter is basically all that, organic matter debris, but also, something like a third to three quarters of the soil organic matter are dead microbes. So if you really want to build soil organic matter, you have to grow the population of microbes. So whatever type of practices that you do that contributes to that population of microbes, it's important for developing that base. So a question for
20 minutes.
for people that do farming, is how do they build that soil organic matter? Other properties, of course, and the most important one in composting is that you are building soil stability and structure. Okay, through composting, you're helping in the microaggregate. Microaggregate happens because of the glues that you find in the binding of microorganisms like bacteria and like fungi in the network through hyphae that allow for those microaggregates to happen. And with microaggregates, you improve the capacity of the soil to reduce erosion, to reduce nutrient leachate, through improving the ways to hold the water capacity of the soil, to improve the water infiltration, to be a much more lower bulk density material, so there's less compaction. With that comes better aeration. And of course, the link to nutrients has to do with the capacity of that organic matter for improve the cation and anion exchange capacity of the soil. So compost brings so much to the mechanisms of building soil organic matter and to improve the stability of the structure of the soil. And of course, we rely on composting in what's called the soil food web, in this what's called the poop loop of this exchange of nutrients that happen through different trophic levels within microorganisms within the soil. And by doing composting, we are continuously providing the soil with this type of mechanism of nutrient recycling. And there are many benefits, as I mentioned, of the healthy food webs that come through working with compost, but specifically the ones to link to climate change has to do with that improvement of soil structure that I've mentioned you before. And this is just a simple the representation of what those micro aggregates in a well-healthy soil might look like. And again, it's a mixer, is a development process that happen through the plant and fungal debris, and that is mixed with the geological properties or mineral property of your soil, whether it be silt and sand and clay. And then again, it's how we manage our soil that we're able to improve it in terms of its capacity to generate those benefits that we're talking about. And this just to illustrate, a very small percentage of what represents the living organic matter and the microorganisms that play a role within our soil is very little, but in terms of its capacity to improve soil for carbon sequestration is very, very important. There's research out there that you can find online. These are research are very hard to do because it has to do with, you know, what's a proper application of carbon or the compost in this case in our soil. And there's a lot of experimentation, control mechanisms, but many of these long-term studies that I've done in marginal lands, you know, lands that have been degraded over time, is that just with one application of compost, you can increase soil respiration and carbon sequestration. You can trigger a whole development of ecosystem in place and increase soil organic matter, but also durable carbon soil in a much more deeper level, not only in the first 6 inches that where we grow food. The density of plant growth and the food is increases. And of course, there's a decrease in the need for water and synthetic fertilizer. And the calculation, one of these studies talks about if with one time application of a 1/4 inch of compost to degraded rangeland, it can sequester more than 14.8 metric tons of carbon per hectare. And that's equivalent to 887 tree seedlings grown for 10 years. That's a lot. And of course, these are marginal lands, so the impact of compost margin situation is much, much bigger than in much more stable agricultural soils. And of course, the application, that just one application has a major impact over years in a level much more deeper than where we grow food. And these are another study, long-term 24-year study from the UC Davis research, where it demonstrates and compares conventional with cover crops and compost with cover crops, and how that impacts in terms of the increase of carbon at the different levels of depth into the soil. And what's key is how it increments even in deeper soils, status of the soil, which is key to the link to storing carbon. And I just did one of of course, the issues here, and something that I have talked to Steve about before, a long time ago, is that I feel that farmers have this responsibility of being land steward, but that's not, you know, that doesn't go into the cost and the price of what we pay for the true cost of food production. You know, you want to produce a yield, but at the same time, you know that you have to invest in soil health and soil conservation. So, and the number here out there is that, you know, Connecticut farm operation account for 380,000 acres of land across the state. That's a lot of acreage. And if you want to provide a 1/4 inch of compost per acre per year, you will need to provide 33.8 cubic yards per acre of compost. And that's around more than 12 million tons of compost. And of course, if you're going to buy this, you know, at $30 per cubic yard, that's a lot of money. So, you know, the only move, if you want to really get into use compost because of all its immediate properties, then the best solution for me is to create opportunities for farmers to do their own composting in farms and receive all that benefit. So I'm going to leave it to this, and hopefully we have some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Domingo. Fantastic. All right, and last but absolutely not at all least, Safra Alexandra, I will turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Save the Sound for hosting this great webinar, and for Domingo and Steve for what they've just presented. Let's see. Can you all see my screen? Emily, can you see it? Yep. Okay. Perfect. My name is Safra Alexandra, and I am the lead of Connecticut NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association's Pollinator Health Initiative, known as the Ecotype Project. Today, I'm speaking to you from Connecticut, which is an Algonquin word that means the long tidal river. And the traditional territory where I grew up is of the Pagosset tribe, which means where the river mouth widens. And so in an effort to understand what we mean about restoration ecology, regenerative agriculture. I want to frame it with kind of those place-based ethos, and making sure that we remember that nature and ecology are not stagnant and not held to boundaries, but actually quite dynamic and constantly moving. And that's what I'll talk to you about, is different ways that just different dispersal mechanisms of seed and so forth. So this map that you all see, if you haven't seen it before, is a wonderful resource from the EPA, and it's called an eco-regional map. And what this does is it forces us to put our bug eyes on, or our ornithological eyes on, because when these animals go through these areas, they don't see the Connecticut to Massachusetts boundary. What they do is they see these habitat community mosaics of where the broadleaf forests are, where the riparian zones are. So this overlay takes soil science, hydrology, forestry, ornithology, all the different disparate facets of what goes into conservation, and says with broad strokes, this is a map that we can work with, that the genetics found within where I sit at Ecoregion 59, in this case talking about plants, where we collect seeds from that area, it can be proliferated throughout that ecoregion and know that we're putting the right plants in the right place, or working with ecotypes. Ecotypes is simply a fancy word that references the place-based genetics. So in an effort to make those truly local native seeds more available, we started the Ecotype project. So again, an ecotype, that local seed. And so how do we get those local seeds out of these wild areas and onto the farm? Because again, we need to start blurring that line of where farms end and the wilderness begins. We need to rewild if we're truly going to have regenerative landscapes. So we work with botanists who understand all the sustainable protocols of what wild collection goes into wild collection and permissions and so forth. We take that seed, we work with organic farmers, we grow out that seed as a crop, seed being our crop, and then I and others go through, collect the seed, clean the seed, stratify, which means mimic winter basically, so that that seed can then germinate with our nursery men and women, who then makes it available to homeowners, landscapers, and municipalities, again, in an effort to fortify these ecological corridors and promote regenerative agriculture. So you can see some of the species that we've begun to work with throughout the project. And as you can see here, they're just gorgeous. Oftentimes we think, native plants horticulturally might not have been utilized in that way, but when we look at how they're being grown on farms for the amplification of seed, we realize that regenerative agriculture is so beautiful. So by having these, and this is at the Hickories, which is Dina Brewster's organic farm in Ridgefield. She's the executive director of CT NOFA and also on the board of Save the Sound. And so what this shows is that this form of agroecological farming, where we're making it so we have habitat, so where our great stewards in farming are the pollinators, are all the animals that help pollinate our crops. Without them, we don't have local food security. Farmers don't have the yield that they need to sell to our local citizens and so forth. So we really need to look at our farm landscapes as, this great partnership dance that we're doing. We need to be able to provide them the food and habitat that they need so they can help us provide the food that we all need. So in this effort, when we're rewilding our landscapes, we're really promoting having the habitat where it's needed for our land stewardship and caretaker partners. And what this does is it makes sure that these seeds are living in our living seed bank, our soils, so that they can proliferate as they have since time immemorial for all future needs. So why is it important to have pollinators on farm? Again, so the blueberries on the left have poor pollination. The blueberries on the right were visited by pollinators. So the pollinators, in the beginning on the farm, if you put these row crops of pollinator crops away from your field crops, then they're not even having that interaction. So by putting these native ecotypes within your field rows, you're making sure that that beautiful dance is happening so we can have this wonderful food. And again, making sure, as Steve said, you want to make sure that you have plants that have this various bloom times, because pollinators like us are eating throughout the season, and we need to make sure we have flowers that bloom at different times, obviously occupy different habitats and different trophic layers of our environment. But the more diversity of plants we have, the more diversity of insect and animal and all, and you know, the hummingbirds, the chipmunks, all the seed dispersal animals come onto your farm. And really, a lot of the problems you face with traditional agriculture is you don't have this beneficial insect diversity on farm. And when we have it on farm, it helps to regulate the problems or the pests you might face through this ecological diversity. It's the normal cycle of what predates on what, and you know, it's how nature and those perennial polycultures we find are so much more resilient than a traditional monocultural system. So you can see these beautiful pictures taken by Jean Linville, who's the head founder plot farmer at the Hickories. And so what's our purpose with this? Well, in terms of helping these green infrastructure projects, restoration projects, from pollinator pathways to land trusts, to all these organizations who want to be helping restore our environment. And and to reduce fragmentation, we need to make these seeds available. The seeds are really not readily available on the commercial market, which is a lot of what we've been doing to fortify this network. And so we're fortifying the supply chain of how we grow the seeds and then get the seeds dispersed. We're training new farmers so that they can implement this in their production. And we're really truly amplifying these seeds. So for restoration and so forth, we can have these right plants in the right place. Your ecotypes in terms of climate change are your best bet, because they've been adapting along with us to all the variations that have been happening in the soil, and they've been able to continually produce seed that is most viable for your eco-regional place-based location. So this is the beautiful New York ironweed. So again, in an effort, because I know we have a short amount of time here, why is it important to be doing ecological restoration eco-regionally? Well, again, you can see another map of what I said about ecoregion 59. But again, remember, like, let's look at the Connecticut River that I mentioned before. Seeds move in all sorts of different ways. There's hydrockery, so that's the dispersal of seeds by water. Anthropockery, the dispersal of seeds by humans. Anemochory, the dispersal of seeds by wind. So all of these seeds that lie, you know, the Connecticut River starts in the Canadian border, goes all the way into Long Island Sound. So all of those seeds are washing down in our riparian corridors. And to look at everyone who's brought to the table around restoration. We have the farmers, you know, we need to rewild those landscapes and blur where those boundaries exist. We have the land trusts and pollinator pathways, homeowners as citizen restorationists, or you know, environmental groups and conservation organizations. We all have a role to play in putting these magnets of biodiversity back within this magnetic dynamic system so that the seeds can be where they need to be. So a fun little expedition we led was called the Botanical Expedition. So I say I'm not a botanist, I'm a botanist. And we took 500 of these native ecotype plants and we paddled from Dartmouth in New Hampshire to the Massachusetts border and planted these ecotype pollinator plants, paddling for the pollinators as we went, in an effort to put, again, these right plants back in the right place and help with their natural seed dispersal mechanisms of putting it back in the living seed bank. Our hope is to paddle this next season all the way down to Long Island Sound and keep on proliferating this idea that we really need to go beyond man-made boundaries and really start pushing the boundaries of where these seeds can proliferate. So I'll show you just a quick little video of what that expedition looked like and encourage all of you to take some truly local native seeds with you when you adventure and help put these back on the landscape. So that doesn't seem to be working. Oh, maybe there we go. So, yep, this is us paddling along with plants. So hopefully all of you that work in ecological restoration or are farmers or at any scale will be able to implement these on your landscape, because as you can see, as this monarch chrysalis is so happy to see its host plants back, we can all work together in fortifying this pathway of regeneration. So thank you so much, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you. All of our presenters. That was fantastic. So we have about 5 minutes. Got a lot of questions in the chat box that I'm gonna start running through. So Steve, there were a bunch of questions during your presentation, and I'm gonna lump 2 of them together because they're kind of similar. So for smaller home gardens, do the same techniques work as you're using on the farm? So you plant a narrow row of dill, flowers, et cetera, next to a row of vegetables. And a tying question with that, I think, is can you use the same cover crop method in raised beds?
So yes to both, and some great resources for that. The Square Foot Gardening book and Great Garden Companions, or Good Garden Companions, I think are really helpful in illustrating what will pair well with what. So, for home gardening, I always say grow what you want to grow. I say that for farmers too, actually. You should grow what you love and what you're excited about. And so if you're going to grow vegetables, there are certainly going to be herbs that pair well with it, and flowers as well. You can fit them in between or right next to them, depending on the plant spacing. I'll just share one of my favorite flowers that I've been incorporating a lot recently, in addition to the dill and cilantro, which I'll let flower, marigold. Really loved marigold for its pest prevention. And this year, my wife started using them for dyeing things. So for dyeing projects and such. So it's been an extra beneficial use. And cover crops, yes, you can do the same types of cover crops. You can, overseed some of the crops you're doing and let them grow underneath. It's really becomes about timing, so you don't have that cover crop interfere with your crop, with your cash crop or whatever you're wanting to grow. So you want to make sure your crop is established, and then grow sort of next to or underneath. Use that cover crop to grow underneath as sort of a protective mulch layer.
This one might be more for Domingo. Do you have any experience recommendations with local seaweed in compost?
Seaweed, it behaves as a feedstock. It behaves as food in terms of its carbon to nitrogen ratio. The difference with food alone is that the seaweed also brings a range of other micronutrients to the compost. So it's a very easy feedstock to manage. The issue is an issue of accessibility. But it's composting very easily, and it certainly enriches the quality of your compost.
Touched on that a little bit on the previous webinar, if you check out our virtual archive page. Safra, what are the best flowers to interplant in a small home garden?
Great question. There's a lot of factors. What does your soil structure look like? What does the habitat you have in the backyard look like? We want to make sure, again, in the effort to put the right plants in the right place, that we're putting, when you walk through the wild lands, you can see what is growing where in terms of what their natural habitat is, and you want to mimic that in your backyard to make it most relatable, and because that's what will ensure that it does best. So I put in our website for the EcoType project, and at the bottom of it, you'll find a getting started toolkit if you want to implement these on your landscape and do what soil conditions and what site conditions best suit each of the species. And I can also put in the Aspetuck Land Trust website, because they do a plant sale with the ecotypes each year, and they have beautiful illustrated guides for how much space you have, how many plants you would need, and how to actually implement it. So yeah, I think we can all work together to decrease the decimation of the biodiversity and loss of wildlands by all implementing these on our landscape.
Can I just tag on with you for another question? What is your opinion on cultivars?
I think, they have a role to play in cultural trade. I think what's important to promote is we want to maintain these vast arcs of the wild genetic diversity, because as I've said before, that genetic diversity has the adaptations to its local eco-regional pressures and pests and climate variations. Cultivars are often, they have the same genetics because they're awfully clonally propagated. So they are selected for their showiness or for different attributes that work in the horticultural landscape. But as my work that you had mentioned in my bio, we see with the Irish potato famine and what happened with taro in the South Pacific, when you rely on a very narrow set of genetic traits, you open yourself up to susceptibility. If something hits it, it would all be susceptible. So we want to promote that diversity in our landscape as much as possible because it's more resilient to whatever factors it may face.
Thank you. We just have like one or two more questions. Aware that it is 1 o'clock right now. If you have to drop off, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you learned a lot from this. I certainly did. And I'm just gonna jump into these last few questions. Steve, what kind of changes in soil organic matter over the 10 years you've been farming, suggesting that you are sequestering atmospheric carbon?
So I have seen an increase in soil organic matter. So we do annual soil testing. I'll also say that, you know, on our farm, there was sort of inactivity for 15 to 20 years. So you get organic matter buildup that way too, just by having the growth of grass and whatever is wildly there, whether they're native species or invasive species. Those are going to grow and die, and that's going to build organic matter as well. And an initial tillage of the soil, initial breaking that ground to start the farm sort of work that we did with vegetables is going to, you know, disturb that soil and lose some organic matter. So we actually, in terms of organic matter, we were in decent shape when I arrived. But other nutrient issues were present, and our pH was very low. Like much of Connecticut soils are very acidic in the 5.2 to 5.3 range, and really vegetables don't thrive. There are some things that do, but most things don't, and so we needed to address that. But yes, I've been able to document through annual soil tests how our overall soil has improved in terms of nutrients, but then also the structure of the soil has changed as well. So particularly in some areas that were impacted, you know, through the kinds of use it had previously, or whether there were structures there and such. So we've got really rich, vibrant soil in places that were totally hard packed previously. Some of it is visual and experiential, but we are tracking through annual soil tests, you know, how that soil has changed over the years.
And then the final question, which Domingo and Steve, you kind of touched on, but on a larger scale. So on a smaller scale, this person has a small organic vegetable garden full of organic matter, and does it hurt the soil when it's turned over before planting?
Well, on our side, you know, the turnover depends on how, you know, how much you disturb the soil is key. From the soil food biology point of view, if you do any deep type of tilling or turning over, you're breaking up the structures that are there in place, you know, your hyphae and your aggregates, and it will take some time to rebuild it again. So the recommendation always to reduce as much as possible the disturbance that you can make. Of course, there are instances that you might need to do it, you know, when you blend a compost in, or when you are tilling in, you know, debris of potential or if you're using cover crops, you know, you want to be able to turn it into the soil, and so microorganisms can help out in breaking it down. But these time, you know, it's not these very, you know, deep type of turning. If it's just at the surface level, it was just going to help out in breaking out this organic matter. The problem with the with the disturbance also is that you expose, you know, protected carbon elements in your soil to, you know, microorganisms, and just for the sheer process of decomposition by the respiration of bacteria, for instance, to be able to decompose, they will liberate CO2, and therefore you're going to lose carbon in your soil. Okay, so it's the level of disturbance, you know, how deep it is and how frequent it is.
Yeah, and I would just add, you know, for most people at home, if you're using hand tools, you're probably doing okay. I think we get worried with tillers that sort of spin and blend the soil and really destroy aggregates and maybe organisms. But I think most of your hand tools that you might be working at home you're probably safe and your soil should be just fine. That's my guess.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you to all of our presenters, Domingo, Steve, Safra. This was fantastic. And thank you to our sponsor, CT NOFA, and all of the members who joined us today for supporting Save the Sound. And stay tuned for our final webinar of the 3-part series, which will focus on renewable energy.
Thanks, Emily. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.